The snow whispered down in a hush, soft as breath, soft as memory. It blanketed the roof of the sagging settler's cabin until it vanished into the white world, a forgotten shape under a heavy sky. Only the thin curl of smoke, faint, fading, gave any sign that life still clung within. Inside, the fire had gone out hours ago. She sat near the hearth, knees drawn to her chest, a thin wool shawl clutched around her shoulders. Her skin looked like paper left out in the sun too long, her lips cracked, tinged with blue. One baby lay nestled beneath the crook of her arm, the other across her chest in a sling made from torn bedsheets. Both stirred weakly, not quite crying anymore. Just little gasps, like birds too cold to sing. Her name had once been Amelia Hastings. Back before her hands were always trembling, before her days were measured by the ache in her back and the tight pull of milk in her chest. Back when she'd believed that kindness, if offered enough times, might come back to her. But kindness hadn't come. Not from her husband. Not from the town. Not even from the land, which had frozen early this year, swallowing the roads and silencing the birds. Even the pine trees looked like they'd turned their backs. Her eyes stayed fixed on the cold hearth. She had tried to relight it. Twice. 3 times. She had scraped the flint until her fingers bled, her palms raw. But the kindling was damp, and her hands too clumsy now. The last match had snapped in half when she struck it. She had stared at the broken piece for a long time before tossing it into the ashes, where it joined the bones of last night's warmth. The babies fussed again, and she shifted them gently, her body a shield against the cold. One suckled half-heartedly. The other barely opened its eyes. She whispered something to them, a lullaby, without a tune. Her voice caught in her throat. A month ago, she had bled out on the floorboards, thinking she was dying. But death hadn't come then. Only pain, and the terrifying silence after the crying started. 2 infants she had no idea how to hold, how to feed, how to name. When her husband left that morning in early November, he had said nothing. No farewell, no glance back. Just walked out the door, saddle creaking, boots crunching in the frost. She had stood in the doorway as long as she could, watching the snow swallow his shape. Her fingers had clutched her round belly then. She remembered thinking, "Don't come back," and then, a heartbeat later, "But please come back." He hadn't. The townsfolk had stopped calling by then. They said the land had cursed her, barren for 5 years, then suddenly heavy with twins. Some whispered witchcraft. Others just crossed the street. Amelia closed her eyes. Her pulse thudded low in her ears. The world tilted slightly. Or maybe she did. She tried to stand, but her knees wobbled. She slid down the wall instead, the babies cushioned in her arms. The room seemed to darken, though no lamps had been lit to begin with. She needed to get help. She knew that. But where? The nearest town was 6 miles, maybe more with the snow. And she wouldn't make it with 2 infants, not without food, not without fire. Still, something stirred in her. Not hope, not quite. Just the old settler stubbornness. That raw-boned will to walk on even with cracked soles and an empty belly. She pressed a kiss to the damp forehead of her smaller child, then shifted them both into a makeshift sling beneath her shawl. Her breath came hard. Her legs felt carved from ash. She opened the door. Snow hit her like a wall. The wind moaned low through the trees. The sky stretched gray and endless. Amelia took 1 step, then another. She didn't think. She just moved. Each footfall a prayer. Each breath a thread. The trees closed around her like cathedral columns. She walked until the cabin was gone. Until the cold no longer stung, just numbed. Her vision blurred. The babies were silent now, tucked close to her chest. She stumbled once, catching herself on a branch. Then again, falling to her knees. Her skirts soaked through. She tried to rise. Couldn't. She tried again. The 3rd time, she stayed down. She found herself under a pine tree, the old kind with branches that bend low and offer shelter. Snow drifted gently onto her shoulders. Her breath came slower now. The babies barely stirred. Amelia curled around them, arms tightening instinctively. There was no fear left. Only a kind of stillness, deep and bone-hollowed. Her eyes fluttered, and the forest blurred into a watercolor of white and shadow. A sound broke through, not loud, but sharp. Distant hoofbeats, muffled by snow. A rhythm like the old heartbeat of the earth. She didn't lift her head. Couldn't. She only whispered, so faintly it might have been a dream. Please, not yet. And then nothing but the hush again, snow settling, branches sighing, the twin's breath against her skin. But the hoofbeats did not fade. They drew nearer, and nearer, until something warm, solid, and alive stepped into the clearing. A silhouette in the snow, tall, still, wrapped in wool and earth tones. A man, horse at his back, bow slung across his chest. He did not speak. He knelt, placed a bare hand gently at her throat, then over one baby's chest, then the other. Amelia didn't wake, but her fingers, curled around the children, flexed slightly. The man took off his cloak and wrapped it around all three. He moved as if the world might break if he was too sudden. He gathered them up, the woman and her children, cradling them with a kind of reverence. The snow fell heavier now, hiding their footprints almost as fast as they were made. The forest closed behind them. The only sign they'd been there at all was a faint impression in the snow, a place where death nearly came and passed by. The pine trees stood tall and mute, their boughs heavy with snow, the forest hushed under a sky the color of smoke. Nothing moved but the slow, steady rhythm of hooves on softened earth, not hurried, not aimless, just steady, certain, the kind of sound that barely breaks the silence, only parts it like a respectful whisper. The man astride the horse wore no badge, no band of color to mark him. Only dark-washed wool and deerskin layered against the cold. His long hair was tied with leather cord, and his eyes, deep-set, almond-shaped, black as crow's wing, swept the land as if listening to something others could not hear. He was Navajo, though most in the nearby towns would not have known what that meant beyond the usual lies. They would have called him savage or ghost walker, depending on their fear. But the truth was simpler. He was a scout, a tracker, a man of the high desert, come north for reasons he didn't speak aloud, not even to himself. He had followed the elk first, and then the quiet. It had begun as a wrongness in the wind, a scent not native to this stretch of pines, smoke too faint for campfire, the sour trace of old milk, of blood cooled and dried. Not fresh death, but something close, something waiting on the edge of it. He had not meant to turn his horse, but the animal obeyed some instinct of its own, veering slightly off the game trail and into the deeper woods. He allowed it. They came upon the shape beneath the tree as dusk pressed down. Not a deer, not a bear. Something smaller, human, folded, curled inward like a seed. He dismounted without a word. Three forms: woman, child, and child again, though one had to look closely to know they were more than a single tangled being. Snow gathered lightly over their backs. The woman's skin had the look of thin stone, her lips gone nearly gray, but her arms still wrapped the infants tightly, a mother's last instinct outliving her strength. He knelt beside her, resting two fingers at the soft edge of her throat. A pulse, faint but present. He felt it again on the smaller bodies, those barely their flickers of life still folded into their fragile chests. His breath rose in a long, slow cloud. He said nothing. No prayers, no cries for help. Just reached for his cloak, thick-woven, smoked against rain, and wrapped it around them all. When he lifted her, the woman did not stir. Her weight was slight, more memory than flesh. He cradled her against him with the ease of one used to carrying silence. The babies he tucked within the folds of fur and wool, their heads nestled at his collarbone where his own warmth might catch them. The ride was slow. He did not go toward town. He had passed that place a week before, all sharp glances and tight mouths. He knew what they thought of women like her, what they might do or not do if he appeared with her in his arms. So he went the other way, deeper. There was a cabin he knew of. Not his, not anymore, but still standing. Once used by trappers who respected neither animal nor season. They'd abandoned it when the river dried up. He had passed through the place during fall, patched the holes in the roof himself with bark and hide. Now it waited. He reached it by dark, the horse huffing plumes of frost, its coat dusted white. Inside, the air held the smell of cedar and old tobacco. He set her down on the narrow cot and wrapped her again in furs, checking her fingers, her cheeks, her breath. The babies were colder still, barely mewling now. He fed them drop by drop from a pouch of goat's milk mixed with herbs. Not perfect, but it would hold them. Through the night, he worked quietly. The fire took time. The wood was dry but stubborn. Sparks finally caught, then spread, bright fingers licking the blackened stones of the hearth. He set a pot to boil snow, stirred in bark shavings, crushed leaves, a few tender roots. He did not sleep. When the woman stirred the next morning, it was not sudden. Her eyes fluttered open like a curtain left half unfastened. She blinked against the low light and tried to rise. Her limbs failed her. He was near, seated on the floor, feeding one of the infants by firelight. His back was straight, his motions gentle. He did not look up at her right away. Only when the child gave a small grunt of contentment did he glance over. Their eyes met. She did not speak. Neither did he. But something passed between them. Not relief, not gratitude. Something quieter. The recognition of life, where only death had been expected. He handed her the baby then, not slowly, not ceremoniously, just as one would return something valuable, something rightfully hers. She took the child with trembling arms, clutching her close, burying her face against the warm skin. Her shoulders shook, though no sound escaped her. He looked away. Later, when her strength allowed her to sit, she asked, "Who are you?" He didn't answer at first. He stood instead, added more wood to the fire. The flames danced in his eyes, turning them copper for a moment. Then finally, "They call me Toe." His voice was low, like the edge of water in a canyon. Always there, even when you could barely hear it. She nodded once, as if that was enough. As if his name settled something loose inside her. Amelia. That was what she said when he asked in return, though her voice cracked around it. Amelia Hastings, as though it still belonged to someone else. The next few days unfolded like slow pages turned by wind. There was no conversation beyond the necessary. No questions about the past, no explanations. Only the sounds of the fire, the soft coos of the babies, and the scrape of a knife against bark as he shaped a cradleboard from pine. She watched him often, in quiet moments when the children slept. The way he moved, not with hesitation, but care. As if the world had to be handled with dignity. He rarely looked at her directly. And yet, when she faltered while carrying water, his hand was there without prompting. When one child would not sleep, he rocked them with a gentle rhythm she could not imitate. His lullabies came in a tongue she did not know, low and melodic, almost like prayer. She found herself listening to him more than speaking. And in the stillness, her body began to mend. The blue left her lips. Her milk came in stronger. Her sleep deepened, unbroken by fear. The babies grew warmer, heavier in her arms. On the fourth day, a snowstorm rolled in. The wind keened outside the shuttered windows, sharp and wild. Inside, the fire glowed gold against the log walls. Amelia sat beside it, both children dozing in her lap. Toe sat across from her, cleaning his bow with a scrap of cloth. The silence was full, not empty. She spoke without looking up. "I thought I was dying." He paused, then said, "You were." Another silence. She swallowed, traced a finger along the curve of her daughter's cheek. "Why did you come?" "To follow something that wasn't right," he said simply. The snow had quiet where there should have been sound. She closed her eyes, letting that answer wrap around her like the cloak he'd used to save them. There were things she wanted to ask. About his past. Why he stayed. What he wanted. But she didn't ask. Some truths didn't need naming to be known. Outside, the wind howled like some old spirit mourning the dead. Inside, the cradle Toe had built rested beside the fire, and two babies breathed slow and sure. Amelia leaned her head against the wall and watched the flames. She did not smile, but she was no longer frozen. And in the hush between them, something warm began to grow. Not love, not yet, but its beginning. Something earned, not owed. Something living. Something that would stay. The days did not pass so much as settle, like dust on old beams or snow on stone. Time inside the cabin moved in a rhythm not marked by clocks or calendars, but by firewood stacked, by babies fed, by the soft creak of wood warming after frost. Amelia no longer felt the line between survival and life so sharply, though she remained cautious of its nearness. Her body, once brittle with cold and grief, began to thicken with steadiness. Her legs carried her from the cot to the hearth now. Her hands no longer trembled when wrapping the twins against her chest. Toe remained, not as a guest, not as a caretaker, simply as a presence. He rose before the sun and returned after it dipped, always with something useful in his hands. Dry kindling, roots from beneath the snow, strips of cured meat. He rarely spoke unless there was reason, yet nothing in his silence ever felt distant. Instead, it settled between them like a shared blanket, the kind of quiet that made room for breath. They did not speak of the past. He did not ask where her husband had gone. She did not ask what trail had brought him this far north, alone. These were not the kind of wounds that healed through retelling. They simply learned each other's patterns, the cadence of footsteps, the weight of mood in a room, the tilt of a glance before it turned away. She watched him when he worked, careful not to let him notice. The way he shaped the pine cradle, whittling it slowly, sanding the edges smooth with a piece of leather and river stone. He touched the wood like it held memory, not just grain. He moved with reverence, not toward her exactly, but toward the space she now occupied, as if he understood the fragility of someone just beginning again. Sometimes, when the babies cried and Amelia felt the fray of her edges returning, he would take them without words, rock one in the crook of his arm while tending to the fire, or carry both swaddled against his chest while chopping more wood outside. The children quieted around him, as if they sensed the absence of panic in his movements. He did not coo, did not babble. He simply stayed. Amelia's days began to find shape again. She boiled water for cloths, mashed dried berries with wild honey when she could find it. Her milk flowed steadily now. The pain in her ribs had dulled, replaced by a strange softness she didn't yet trust, the ache of not being alone. She began to hum again, not songs with words, just half-remembered melodies, bits of lullaby and hymn woven into one another. Sometimes, Toe would pause near the doorway when she sang, not close, not listening directly, just near enough that his stillness felt like attention. One evening, while snow tapped against the roof like a patient guest, Amelia sat by the fire and watched the cradle swaying gently. The baby slept belly to belly, tiny fists curled. Her hands were sore from gathering and stitching scraps of linen into swaddles. The needle had pricked her thumb, and a dark bloom of dried blood marked the fabric. She stared at it, wondering at the odd beauty in something so small, so human. Toe sat across the room, restringing his bow with new sinew. His hair was loose, drying from a recent wash, and the fire made it glint like wet earth. His fingers worked quickly, but not carelessly. She found herself watching those fingers more than the task they performed. "I used to sew," she said, not looking up from the blood-specked cloth. "When I was a girl. Doll dresses. Pillow seams." Toe didn't respond at first, but his hands slowed slightly. Then, softly, "Good hands remember." She let the quiet stretch. "I didn't think mine would." He nodded once, as if that truth needed no fixing. Later that night, when a windstorm clawed at the shutters and one of the twins cried with a feverish whimper, Amelia felt the fear claw up again, that old, sharp beast of helplessness. She lifted the child, tried to nurse, but the baby refused to latch. She bounced her gently, then more firmly. Her own breath began to break. Toe appeared without sound. He reached out, pausing just long enough for her to choose. She handed the baby over. He cradled the child against his chest, pulled the blanket higher, then began a low hum, a tonal, spiraling sound, not quite melody. It wrapped around the baby like smoke, gentle and circling. The tiny body calmed. The crying ebbed. Amelia watched, tears catching along her lashes, unnoticed. She hadn't meant to weep. It simply happened, a slow leak of something long dammed. She didn't thank him. He didn't expect it. The next day, the fever passed. When morning came, pale and bright as new parchment, Amelia opened the cabin door and stepped outside without leaning on the frame. The air still held winter's breath, but the sun touched her face with something close to promise. Toe was by the edge of the clearing, examining a rabbit snare. She didn't call to him. She just stood there, the babies asleep inside on the fur-lined cradle. She looked at the trees, not as a place that had tried to kill her, but as something else now. Shelter. Witness. The place she had not died. That evening, she roasted a handful of tubers Toe had brought, adding the last of the salt she'd found in a tin buried deep in her satchel. They ate together at the low table he had built, one carved from a felled aspen, with legs that didn't quite match. Amelia watched him eat in his quiet way, never greedy, never rushed. When he caught her gaze, he didn't look away. "I didn't think anyone would come," she said. He didn't need to ask when. "I laid down to die," she continued, voice soft. "And part of me wanted to." Toe set his bowl down, hands resting on either side. "You didn't die." She nodded slowly. "Because you found me." His reply came slow, measured, as if spoken from a deeper place. "I found someone who hadn't left yet." They didn't speak more that night. The fire burned steady, throwing shadows on the log walls like dancers long forgotten. The babies stirred only once, and then settled. Before Amelia drifted to sleep, she looked at the cradle, then at the man who had carved it. There was still pain, yes, still grief with no place to settle. But there was something else now, too, a shape beneath the ash. Not love, not yet, but the first ember of it. And in the dark, she turned toward the warmth, not away. Spring came in a hush, not a trumpet. The snow melted slow, like it was reluctant to leave, and the pines stood dripping in silence. Ice loosened its grip on the earth, and the river began to murmur again beneath the crust of frost. Amelia watched it from the porch, the twins bundled in her arms, their small breaths soft against her collarbone. Toe stood a little ways off, checking the packs. He did not try to change her mind. It was Amelia who said the words first. "I have to go back." She didn't explain it, didn't name the things buried under that need. Land papers, debts, a grave she hadn't yet dug. Toe only nodded. There was no trace of disappointment in his face, only the kind of quiet understanding that came from someone who had long ago stopped expecting the world to be kind. They traveled slow. The wagon had rotted through the winter, so Toe led the horse on foot, with Amelia and the twins balanced in a carrier strapped to his back. She offered to take turns, but he shook his head. "You've carried enough." The road was harder than she remembered. Frozen ruts turned to mud, and even the trees seemed less friendly, more like watchers and guardians. Amelia kept her eyes forward. She tried not to remember the last time she'd seen this path, hollow-bellied, staggering through the snow, praying for death or mercy. The town appeared like a smudge on the horizon, smoke rising from chimneys too clean, too neat. It hadn't changed. That made it harder. She had. They entered just after noon, when the sun was high and judgment clearer. Amelia felt the first stares before she saw them, eyes on her from behind lace curtains, from porches with idle brooms. Some paused their sweeping. Others pretended not to see her. The twins made no sound, but she could feel their small bodies tense against her chest, sensing the change. The general store was the first stop. She needed flour, a spool of thread, soap. Toe tied the horse and stayed outside, arms folded loosely. His presence alone drew looks, long, cautious, like men watching fire from across a field. Inside, the bell over the door rang out like an accusation. The storekeeper was a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Brecken, who had once offered Amelia a pie after church, back when she was a newlywed. Now she simply stared. "Well," she said at last, "didn't expect to see you back." Amelia said nothing at first. She placed a list of items on the counter and reached into her satchel for coins. Mrs. Brecken didn't move. Her eyes drifted to the sling, where one twin stirred and let out a soft noise. "I heard your man left. Took a job down south." "He's dead," Amelia replied evenly. "If he ever counted as mine." There was no sorrow in her voice, only truth. It hung there, quiet and cold. The woman pursed her lips. That cradleboard out front. You come back with the Navajo. Amelia didn't flinch. I came back alive. That ended the conversation. The goods were bagged without small talk. No offer of credit. No farewell. On the street, a boy threw a rock that missed the horse's leg by inches. Toe didn't move, didn't react. Amelia saw his jaw tighten, saw the way his hand hovered for a moment, not near a weapon, but like he was measuring the weight of restraint. They passed the church on their way to the undertaker's. Amelia paused. The shutters were open. Hymns drifted from the windows like smoke from an old fire. Inside, the pews were clean. No one turned to look at her. The graveyard behind the chapel had a space between the rows, an old field her husband had staked out for them, long before time had shown him what for better or worse really meant. Amelia knelt in the thawing dirt. She had no headstone, no words, just a rough cross of bark tied with twine. She didn't cry. She only whispered, "You left me in the snow." The wind did not answer. She hadn't expected it to. Toe waited by the fence. When she returned to him, her hands were dirty. He offered her a cloth. She took it, folded it into her palm, and did not let go. That night, they camped at the edge of town rather than beg shelter from anyone with a roof. Toe lit a fire with pine cones and dried moss. The children slept in the cradle he'd tied to a bough. Amelia sat with her knees tucked to her chest, staring into the flames. "It hasn't changed," she said after a while. "No," he replied. "I thought maybe if I showed them I survived, they'd see me different." He didn't correct her, just let the silence stretch, safe and steady. She turned to him, eyes sharp in the firelight. "They don't want me. Not the children. Not my grief. Not the kind of strength that comes from crawling out of a grave." Toe looked at her, long and full. "I do." The words were soft, but they landed like a stone in still water. Amelia didn't speak. She didn't need to. Something in her face cracked, not broke, but opened. A small shift, like ice turning to water. Not love, not yet. But trust, grown from firelight and long silences. Trust that did not ask her to earn her worth. The next morning, before the town could fully wake, they walked away. Amelia didn't look back. They took the north road, where the pines thickened and the land was still half wild. There were other places to live, places with no memories etched into every doorframe, places that didn't require her to shrink in order to belong. The sky broke open at midday. Rain came down in a slow weeping mist, soft enough not to chill, but steady enough to soak through threadbare sleeves. Toe didn't curse it. Amelia didn't either. They simply walked, two figures moving through the wet, green hush of spring, the baby snug between them. It wasn't freedom yet, but it was forward. And as the rain traced down her temple, Amelia reached for Toe's hand. Not to be led, not to be saved, but to walk beside. The new land was quieter. They found it past a crooked bend in the river, where the trees grew thinner and the hills rolled soft like folded quilts. No fences, no footsteps. Just grass bent by wind, and birds calling names that no white town had ever written down. The land didn't ask who she was. It didn't care where she'd come from. That made it easier to breathe. They built slowly. First a lean-to, then the cabin. Not grand, not even sturdy by rancher standards, but it stood upright and dry, and Amelia had a say in where every beam laid. Toe cut the wood himself, singing low sometimes in his language, voice deep and sure as the axe's rhythm. She'd gather stones for the hearth, strap the twins to her back, while she planted little patches of onion and yarrow by the stream. In the evenings, they'd sit by the growing fire, smoke curling like a story waiting for a voice. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, back when she still believed in parlors and church bells and embroidered linens. But it was the one that fit her hands now, rough-edged and weather-worn, but real. The babies grew into toddlers, all elbows and laughter. One walked early, the other talked first. They answered to Navajo nicknames, and Amelia didn't correct them. Sometimes she still woke at night, heart racing, thinking she'd forgotten to feed them or left the fire too low, the old fear curling at the edges. But then she'd hear Toe breathing steady beside her, or the girls murmuring in their sleep, and the panic would pass like a gust through tall grass. Toe spoke more now, but never too much. He spoke when words meant something, when Amelia doubted herself, when she bent over in the garden with hands on her knees and whispered, "I don't know how to do this." He would say things like, "You're doing it." Simple, whole, unshakable. One night, the air turned suddenly warm. Summer in the hills arrived in a single breath, the kind that carries a storm in its mouth. Amelia stepped out into the dusk, the twins already tucked in their corner of the room, bellies full of sweetened root mash and stories about deer tracks. Toe stood at the edge of the field, staring west. She knew that look. Stillness wrapped in tension. The air held a strange charge, like the pause between a heartbeat and a wound. She moved beside him. "What is it?" He didn't speak right away. Then, quietly, "Someone's coming." The old fear stirred. Townsfolk? Ranchers? The men who'd scoffed at the sight of her walking beside a Navajo warrior with her chin high and her babies dark-eyed and curious? She said nothing. She just reached for the children, strapped them again to her chest and hip, and doused the fire to coals. She had learned. Stillness could be safety. But Toe didn't move to run. He stayed, bow in hand, not drawn. A rider appeared at twilight's edge, cloaked and slow-moving, leading a second horse. Amelia's throat clenched. But as the figure drew closer, she saw no rifle, no badge. Just a weather-beaten man and a weary expression. He carried a letter sealed in wax. "To Amelia Hastings," he said. Like tasting a name he wasn't sure he believed belonged here. She stepped forward, one child clinging to her sleeve. "I'm Amelia." He handed her the letter, nodded once to Toe, and turned back the way he came. Not a word more. She broke the seal with a breath held too long. Inside a folded deed. Land. Not the patch they lived on, but her original claim, left unmarked when her husband vanished. Some lawyer, it seemed, had taken interest in her survival. The town couldn't claim what she still lived to own. Toe watched her face shift as she read. "You could sell it," he said, watching her carefully. "I could," she replied. "But you won't." Amelia smiled then, small and true. "It's just dirt." They burned the letter that night. Let the flames eat every lie that had ever called her worthless. Let the wind carry the ash away. Later, as the girls dreamed of rivers and moccasins, Amelia lay beside Toe beneath a blanket stitched with mismatched threads. The fire crackled low beside them. "I was never meant for town," she whispered. "I bent myself into shapes for years trying to belong. And all along it was this dirt, this silence, this man beside me, that made me feel real." He looked at her then, long and deep. Belonging doesn't come from being seen by many. It comes from being known by one. Her throat tightened. "You see me." His hand found hers beneath the blanket. Not grasping, not claiming, just touching. "I always did." The wind outside shifted again, not sharp now, but warm, like breath against the back of the neck. Thunder rolled far off, promising rain that wouldn't bite. She rose before dawn the next morning, fed the children, packed a basket with berries and small loaves. Toe was already awake, sharpening a blade with the twins clambering at his feet. When the storm came, it broke fast, sheets of silver sweeping the hill, thunder echoing through the bones of the earth. The fire held. The roof did too. They stood in the doorway together, watching the storm run wild. Amelia leaned into him, soaked and grinning, the babies squealing with delight. Mud covered their toes. The world smelled like earth and lightning. It struck her then, not gently, but with the full force of a life reclaimed. She had not been rescued. She had risen. And the man beside her hadn't saved her. He had simply stayed, through storm and silence, judgment and fire. And when everything else had melted away, reputation, past, even her name spoken with disdain, what remained was this. Hands calloused from building, eyes that did not flinch, a fire that had chosen her again and again, without asking for anything in return but truth. And in the quiet that followed the thunder, Amelia looked at the man she had once thought a stranger, and knew, without a word, that she had finally come home. The wind had a memory to it that afternoon, the kind that smells of dry wood, iron soil, and something almost forgotten. The sky stretched wide and hot, color of hammered copper, and the earth below it cracked like an old plate passed down too long. Across that quiet, sun-wounded land stood a house not much more than a breath against the prairie, boards gray with age, corners softened by time and dust. It sat alone, stitched in nothing but miles. Alma lived there. She was the kind of woman the world had mistaken too many times. Broad-shouldered, not from nature, but from hauling water in buckets and mending fences that refused to hold. Her hair was the color of late wheat, worn always in a long braid tied with a strip of old lace. She moved without hurry, not out of laziness but reverence, as if even the dullest tasks might carry some small holiness if done with care. Alma believed in such things. Quietly, fiercely. The town some 8 miles off called her the widow who wasn't. Not out of cruelty, not exactly. But that's how they spoke, with nicknames, whispers, and sideways glances. She had never worn a ring, but long ago there had been a man, Silas Boone, with a voice smooth as velvet and a temper sharp as a broken bottle. He'd come through on his way to California gold, wooed her with poems someone else surely wrote, and made promises the desert knew better than to believe. He left one morning before sunrise, leaving only the shape of him on her bedsheets and a coffee cup still warm. She had not chased him. Alma planted vegetables instead. Come spring she coaxed tomatoes from soil too stubborn for such sweetness. In autumn she preserved every jar with her name and the date, though no one ever opened them but her. She kept her home swept, her hands busy, and her eyes soft. There was always a basin of clean water by the front step, with a ladle resting against its side. Travelers passed through from time to time, cowhands, drifters, peddlers of dust and dime novels. And if they stopped, she nodded and said nothing. The water was enough. Once, a child from the town asked her why she lived out there alone. Alma had bent down, dusting flour from her skirt, and said, "I don't mind the silence. It listens better than most folk." Still, the quiet carried weight. And sometimes at night, with only the coyotes for company, Alma would open her cedar box and read old letters never sent. One was folded more than the others, its edges soft as linen. To Silas, not out of longing, but because it reminded her she could still feel once. She never did send it. She had no desire to reopen a door she'd spent years learning to close gently. The sun began its descent, lengthening the shadows across the fields until they seemed to reach for her house like fingers. Alma stood barefoot on her porch, shelling peas into a tin bowl, each drop a soft little thud against metal. Her dog, Scout long gone to age, had once curled at her feet during such evenings. She missed his snore, missed the weight of another heartbeat nearby. Across the dirt path that led nowhere in particular, the air shimmered, the kind of shimmer that could be heat or hope. A bird wheeled overhead, circling something she couldn't see. Alma shaded her eyes. Nothing there. Then the wind changed. It came cooler, brushing past her cheeks with a sigh that felt known. And not 5 minutes later, she saw it, the faint silhouette of a rider, small at first, then slowly unfolding like a picture from a book, real and not. She didn't flinch. She didn't hide. Alma simply went inside, fetched a clean basin she kept covered for just such days, poured in cool well water, and set it back down on the step. She wiped her hands on her apron, returned to her peas. Didn't look up again until the hooves fell silent. He didn't dismount right away. The man sat on his horse like he'd grown from the saddle itself, all bone and dust and shadow. His skin was dark, sun-worn, not with the paleness of cowboys, but the bronze stillness of canyon stone. A woven sash lay across one shoulder, and feathers hung from his braid, not for decoration, but meaning. Alma nodded once, small. He looked down at the basin, then at her. His eyes were the kind you don't often meet, not because they were hard, but because they were unafraid. She had known fear, and she knew now he didn't carry it. He slid down in one motion, graceful and quiet. The horse stood, patient, as if understanding this moment mattered. He drank. Not greedily, but like someone who respected water more than most. Each dip of the ladle was deliberate. A pause. Then the next. Alma kept her eyes on the horizon. When he finished, he placed the ladle back, gently. Their eyes met just for a breath. And in that breath, something passed, not story, not language, but the kind of seeing that recognizes pain and peace and doesn't flinch from either. Then he nodded. That was all. Alma didn't ask his name. He didn't ask hers. He turned, remounted, and rode on. But when the sun had dipped low and her bowl was full, she stepped off the porch and saw something tucked beside the basin. A feather. Long, dark, tipped and red. Not dropped, not forgotten, but placed. Intentionally. A mark. A message, perhaps. Though she could not read it, she understood its weight. Alma knelt, touching it just once. Her fingers trembled in a way she hadn't known they still could. That night, the wind curled soft around the corners of the house, and the stars blinked low and heavy. She didn't light the lamp. She sat by the window and listened. Not for hoofbeats, not for coyotes, but for something else entirely. And, in the distance, so faint she thought it might be her own breath, she heard it. A drum. One beat. Then two. Then stillness. Alma rose and poured another basin of water, just in case tomorrow asked again for kindness. The morning after the rider came and went, the land held its breath in a way Alma had not felt in years. The dew didn't cling to the grass like it usually did. Birds sang quieter. Even the fence posts seemed to stand a little straighter. She moved through her routine, feeding the hens, sweeping the porch, checking for gopher holes in the garden. But something about her motion had shifted. Not slower, not faster. Just more aware, as if the world had placed a question in her hands and was waiting to see how she might answer it. By noon the sun had risen high enough to flatten shadows. The air shimmered again near the horizon, and she caught herself watching the trail too often, wiping her palms on her apron, though they weren't dirty. She told herself she wasn't expecting anyone. She'd given water. That was all. But her mind returned to the feather, how carefully it had been placed, how deliberate its quiet offering had felt. So when the rider returned, Alma didn't pretend she was surprised. But neither did she pretend to understand why her breath caught. He came from the north this time, same horse, same stillness. She noticed the way he scanned the land first, eyes not just seeing, but reading. He dismounted slower today, like he was no longer just passing through, but stepping into something. Alma didn't speak. She didn't need to. He approached the basin again, touched the ladle with the same reverence, drank slowly. She watched the way his throat moved, the way his fingers curled around the wood, like someone who did not take life for granted. This time, when he looked at her, it lingered. There was no sharpness in his gaze, just patience, tempered like old iron. He didn't smile, but something softened around his eyes, and Alma felt it. Not attraction, not yet. Something older than that. Like when you find a familiar rhythm in a stranger song. She gestured toward the bench beneath the cottonwood tree, its bark pale and peeling in the afternoon heat. He considered it, then sat. She followed. They sat with the space of a small table between them, though there was no table, only dirt and the slow crunch of cicadas in the distance. He said his name, voice low as riverbed gravel. Toya. She repeated it back, careful with each sound. He nodded, approving. Then silence returned, not awkward, just whole. Toya pointed to the well in the distance, then to the basin. She nodded, drew from it every day, even when no one came. Especially then. He nodded again. Then he touched his chest lightly, 2 fingers, and said something in his own tongue. She didn't know the words, but she understood the tone. Respect. Gratitude. She offered bread. It was still warm from a hearth, wrapped in linen. He took it without ceremony, as if the gift were already part of the land. He ate slowly, chewing with purpose. Alma folded her hands in her lap, unsure whether to speak or simply listen to the wind between them. Her words had so often been used against her, twisted, misheard, discarded. But here, with this man who said so little, silence became a kind of trust. Finally, he spoke again. Edge of water, he said, tapping his chest once more. Toya. She blinked. That's what your name means. He gave a small nod. Alma let the meaning roll in her mind like a stone across a creek. Edge of water. It sounded like a place between two things, between thirst and relief, between endings and beginnings. She liked it. She told him her name. Just Alma. No meaning in it, not one she'd ever been told. He looked at her for a long moment, then pointed at the feather now tied to her porch post. You kept it. She nodded. Didn't seem right to put it away. He smiled then, not a full smile, just the corner of his mouth giving in to something lighter. They sat a while longer. She asked no questions. Neither did he. And yet, she felt like they had said more in that shared quiet than most people ever did over supper and scripture. When the sun began its descent, he rose. She thought he might go without a word, as before, but instead he stepped toward the horse and retrieved something from the saddlebag, a small pouch tied with rawhide. He handed it to her. She opened it carefully. Inside, a handful of dried leaves, sweet-smelling and brittle. She looked to him for explanation. He said one word, Sipapu. She had heard the term once from an old book years ago. A sacred place, a passage, the origin from which the people emerged. She didn't know what he meant by giving it to her, but she knew it was not a careless gesture. She folded the pouch closed with both hands, gently, as though it might hold the breath of something ancient. Toya touched his fingers to his temple, a sign of parting. Then he mounted and turned without haste, riding west. Alma stood there until the horse vanished into the dust. Her hand still held the pouch like a small heartbeat. That evening she did not read the old letters. Instead, she brewed a pot of tea and sat under the cottonwood, letting its leaves murmur above her. Her thoughts weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Something in her chest had shifted, not cracked open, just loosened, like a door left unlatched to welcome whatever wind might come. She placed the pouch on her table, beside the feather. Outside, the dusk deepened, and somewhere beyond the ridge, just before the first stars blinked awake, a coyote howled, not lonely, but calling something home. The morning came not on wings, but with the heavy tread of something waiting just beyond sight. The light was thick and reluctant, draped over the hills like a blanket not yet ready to be pulled back. Alma woke with the weight of unfinished dreaming behind her eyes and a dull ache in her hands, though she'd done nothing the day before to earn it. The air was hushed, not peaceful, stilled, the way the woods go quiet before thunder. She stepped out to the porch with her coffee and froze. Circles. Boot prints, neat and deliberate, ringed the edge of her home, not the lazy paths of someone passing by, but intentional. Wide loops around the house, pressed deep into the dust, like questions carved into skin. They hadn't been there the night before, and they didn't belong to Toya. She would have known the quiet rhythm of his step, the lighter indentation of a man who moved with the land rather than against it. These steps were heavier, bolder. Alma's first instinct was not fear. It was stillness. She stood with the coffee cooling in her hands, letting her mind move slowly. This had happened before in smaller ways. Cattle moved. A gate unlatched that she knew she'd secured. The faint scent of smoke from nowhere. This land had always lived between lines, and she'd made peace with that. But this was different. Scout, her old dog, had once barked at nothing for hours, hackles high and eyes fixed on the tree line. He'd sensed what she could not. Now there was only her, and circles. In town, there would be talk. By midday, she was there. The general store smelled of rope and molasses. Men leaned on counters that didn't belong to them, and women whispered between the fabric bolts. Alma walked in as she always did, head high, pace measured. And still, the room felt quiet in that way it did when the subject of gossip walks through the door before the stories finished being told. She asked for salt, flour, and a spool of thread. The owner's boy fetched them quickly. He liked her, thought her mysterious, maybe, or just kind. But it was old Mrs. Carrow who broke the silence. "You hear about the tracks?" she asked, voice high and taut, like a line pulled too tight between fence posts. Alma didn't answer. "Some say they've been seen out near the bluffs. Watching. Circling. They. Them." Navajo, or Apache, or worse. Another woman clucked her tongue. It's not safe anymore, not with them moving like that. You live too far out, Alma. Always have. A man spoke next, one she hadn't seen in 2 years. Silas Boone. Leaner now. Dustier. Still carrying that empty charm like a polished revolver. All gleam, no bullet. He stepped forward like someone who had the right. I could ride you out, he offered. Voice warm at the edges, but hollow at the core. To my place. Just till things quiet down. Alma looked at him for a long moment. She saw the same man who had left without saying goodbye, standing here now pretending time could be folded like laundry and put back in its place. She did not speak cruelty. She simply said, I'm fine. He smiled too quick. Didn't figure you'd take help. She met his eyes. No. I just know the kind that doesn't mean it. Silas looked away first. She returned home under a sky thick with heat, the clouds heavy, but not bursting. The silence was louder now, no birdsong, no rustle of rabbit or snake. Just wind moving like a thought you can't shake. By late afternoon, they came. At first, only shadows on the ridge. Then horses. Dark figures against the light. Too many to count. A slow, deliberate line forming like a curtain drawn across the earth. They didn't move forward. Didn't call out. Just watched. Alma didn't run. She poured water into the basin. Laid out bread. Braided her hair. If she would meet what came, she would meet it as herself, not a shrinking thing, not a woman who begged to be spared. The first horse stepped forward, and from it dismounted Toya. He walked with the gravity of stone, each step neither rushed nor threatening. His eyes held something deeper than warning, something older than explanation. When he reached her, they stood in the slow hush of twilight, where nothing dared breathe but the grass. You were watched, he said. Alma didn't ask why. She understood what was meant. Not spied on, not hunted, witnessed. They wanted to see what you'd do, he continued. If you'd run, if you'd fear. And now, his jaw moved slightly. Now they know. Behind him, the riders began to dismount slowly, respectfully. Some stayed with the horses. Others stood, quiet, arms crossed. There were no weapons drawn, no challenge, just presence. Alma's eyes drifted over the faces, some young, some lined like bark, all silent, all steady. Their expression wasn't anger. It was calculation, perhaps, or something sacred, a measuring. She turned back to Toya. And you? His voice was low, but certain. I told him you gave water. Without question. Without fear. That shouldn't be rare. But it is. He glanced to the feather tied to her post. You honored it. I felt it meant something. It did. Alma didn't know what came next. But something inside her shifted again, like the slow creak of a door that's been closed too long. Not flung open. Just eased, enough to let in air. Toya stepped aside and motioned gently toward the house. May we sit, he asked. She nodded. They gathered around the porch. Some sat on the ground. Others leaned against their mounts. No one spoke for a long time. There was only the crackle of a breeze through the mesquite, the low murmur of hoof and breath, and the soft clink of the ladle resting against the basin. As night came, Alma lit a lantern. Its glow reached only a little way, but none of them seemed to mind. Light didn't matter when understanding had already taken root. A young woman in the group began to hum, just a thread of sound, wordless and gentle. Another man tapped a rhythm against his knee. No drums. No spectacle. Just a heartbeat rising from dust and memory. Toya leaned against the porch post, arms folded. You could have feared us, he said quietly. I didn't. Why? She looked down at her hands. Because not every stranger is a threat. Some are just thirsty. He nodded. And for the first time since he'd appeared on her land, he sat beside her. Not across. Not apart. Together. When the stars began to scatter like spilled sugar across the sky, no one had left. They were not guarding. They were not threatening. They were keeping company. Alma closed her eyes just for a moment and felt it, not safety, not exactly. Something older. Something like belonging. like having been chosen by something you never applied for. And that night, for the first time in years, she dreamed without ghosts. The fire was lit just after the stars took full hold of the sky, not a roaring thing, but a low and steady blaze, its light soft as a memory. It crackled in the center of the circle they had formed without words, without command. The warriors moved as if guided by a rhythm born from bone, not voice. They didn't look to Toya for direction. They already knew where to sit, where to stand, when to be silent. It was the kind of unity Alma had never seen, not in church pews nor town meetings, and certainly not in the arms of Silas Boone. The fire gave shape to everything. Faces, hands, glances, breath. Shadows danced up the sides of her home, not haunting, but watchful. The heat curled gently against her skin as she sat beside Toya, neither too close nor far. In this moment, they were not strangers, not even guests. They were part of the same stillness. Toya passed her a strip of smoked meat wrapped in sage, and she took it with both hands. Small gestures meant something here, more than words ever had in the life she'd known. She chewed slowly, tasting the story in every fiber. Across the fire, an elder with hair silver as river ice began to hum, the same note the young woman had sung earlier, now deeper, woven with gravel and breath. Alma couldn't understand the words that followed, but she understood the meaning. Grief, grace, return. When the song faded, a younger man, barely more than a boy, stood and approached the fire. He threw in a handful of blue cornmeal, and the flames flared, licked the sky, then settled. The scent that rose was sweet, smoky, a prayer made scent. Then came the silence, not empty, full, like lungs after a deep breath held just before release. Toya spoke not loudly, but every ear turned toward him. She lives on land once walked by our blood. Her well pulls water from earth, where our bones once rested. A murmur passed through the group, not alarm, not anger, acknowledgement. She did not guard it. She did not claim it. She gave. Toya turned his eyes to Alma. You offered water before you knew my name. I didn't need to know it, she said, voice low but steady. You were thirsty. That was enough. He nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something more ancient than the night itself. The elder across the flames spoke next, his voice rough, dry as the cliffs. Toya translated when he finished, the words falling like stones into a still pool. He says the land remembers, that it watches more than men do, and it trusts slow hands, not loud mouths. Alma looked down at her calloused fingers, at the crescent dirt beneath her nails from this morning's digging, at the burn on her forearm from where she'd reached too deep into the hearth. Her hands had not been made for fine things, but they were strong and steady, and known now. She felt a stirring inside her chest, not pride, something gentler, the knowledge that her life, small and unspoken as it had been, had mattered. That her days alone, her quiet rituals, her unthanked offerings, they had not gone unseen. Toya leaned in then, voice lower. They feared you might treat us like others have been treated. She turned toward him. With suspicion? With mercy twisted into bargain? Or worse, kindness that expects a ledger? Alma looked into the fire, the truth catching like wind in her throat. I have nothing to trade. He considered her a moment. You have honesty. That is rarer than gold. A pause passed between them, soft and whole. She reached for the pouch he had given her days before and opened it now, in full view of the firelight. The sweet scent of sapapu leaves unfurled into the circle, and every head turned. Alma stood, walked carefully to the fire, and knelt. She whispered something, not a prayer, not quite, and tossed the leaves into the flames. The response was immediate and subtle. A few nodded. One woman closed her eyes. The elder's smile was barely there, but it changed the whole shape of his face. It was not just the act of burning the leaves. It was how she had done it, slowly, with both hands. The way she had let silence fill the space between motion and meaning. Toya stood beside her now. You honored it, he said, not as question, but confirmation. I didn't know what it meant, she said, but I could feel it asked for respect. He looked down at her for a long breath. Then he reached into the leather pouch at his side and drew out something wrapped in red cloth. When he opened it, the fire caught on the edges of a carved stone, shaped like a human hand. Palm open, lines etched in bone-deep grooves. He placed it in her hand. It was warm, as if it had been waiting for her. "It means open hand," he said. "It is how we show readiness. To give, to receive, to hold or to release." Alma's fingers curled around it. The circle stayed by the fire well into the night, but one by one they rose, offered silent gestures of departure, a touch to the heart, a nod to the earth, and walked into the darkness as quietly as they had arrived. By the time the flames dimmed to ash, only Alma and Toya remained. He did not speak immediately. They sat together, both watching the embers curl and sigh. "I cannot stay," he said finally. She nodded. "But I will return." That wasn't a promise. It was something truer, a decision still being made, shaped like river stone in the hands of time. "Why did you come back?" she asked him. Toya looked at her then, and for the first time, his expression broke open into something close to sorrow and joy at once. "Because you made space. Without knowing who I was, or what I might carry, you let me exist without fear." Alma felt tears rise, not from sadness, from recognition. They stood. The night was nearly gone. The first brush of dawn curled pale and uncertain along the edge of the hills. He mounted his horse without flourish. The wind caught the feathers at his braid and scattered them gently. As he turned, Alma stepped forward. "I don't expect anything. I know, but the door will remain unlatched." He gave the smallest smile. "That is more than most ever offer." He rode off into the horizon, not quickly, not slowly, just enough to leave his presence lingering behind, like smoke after cedar has burned. Alma stood alone, though she did not feel it. The fire behind her had died, but its heat remained in her bones. She held the carved hand in her palm and felt its meaning settle. She had not been rescued. She had not been chosen. She had not been changed. She had been seen. And sometimes that is the only miracle the world has left to offer. Later, as the morning broke open and the sky softened, Alma refilled the basin by her door, tying the feather tighter to the porch post so it would not drift. And to the wind, to you, to us, to whoever might be listening, her story whispers still. When you give without wanting, wait without seeking, and love without naming it love, the world remembers you. Not loudly, not all at once, but in circles drawn gently in dust, and in strangers who see the water you leave out and leave something behind in return.